So good morning, everyone. I'm Rory Ring. I have the distinct pleasure of being the CEO for the Sault Ste. Marie Chamber of Commerce, and also as a representative on a committee of our Northern Chamber of Commerce network. And we've distributed this across Northern Ontario for our session today, and that will also be available to anybody in Northern Ontario for viewing as well. And I'm pleased to welcome Chris Benedetti, of managing partner of Sussex Strategy, but I'll let Chris introduce himself when we get his presentation rolling here. But first, I'd just like to begin by acknowledging that we are on this meeting virtually on the traditional territorial ancestral lands of the Ojibwe people from Garden River and Batchewana First Nations. The Anishinaabe people of this sacred and spiritual place is being known since time immemorial as Bawating. We wish to honor the Anishinaabe and Métis on this part of Turtle Island as we recognize their homeland in the spirit of partnership and reconciliation. I think it's appropriate too that we also just take a moment to recognize the struggle of the people of Ukraine as we watch with horror at the atrocities being inflicted upon the people of a free and democratic country. Our thoughts and prayers are with them. So just before we move on to today's agenda, I'd just like to acknowledge that we do have some board members attending today. Derek Jackson, our treasurer, Ian Grant, Jason or Jay Nacarado, excuse me, Randy Shurin, Tim Harmer, and I believe Sherry Burlingoff is with us as well today. So thank you all for attending today's session. And also I just want to thank my staff, Don Ferguson and Maggie Murray, instrumental in helping us execute these events and ensure that we're connecting with our membership and engaging our membership in the things that we do as your representatives in the community and representing you as difference makers in our community, Northern Ontario and Canada. So again, thank you all very much for joining us. And Chris, without further delay, I turn the floor over to you, and I'll allow you to introduce yourself and your team. And we're really looking forward to this session and bringing us up to speed on the current and the future needs of energy in Northern Ontario and how critical it is going to be to our economy of the future. Chris, thanks very much, and over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Rory, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to join you. And I know when Rory and I first talked about doing this session, we talked about doing it in person in Sault Ste. Marie, which would have been absolutely my preference. I love being up in the Soo. I love being in Northern Ontario, really miss it. Although I have had the opportunity to go up a few times over the course of the pandemic, it's a great place, and hopefully I'll get to see you, Rory, and others in person soon. This morning, we're going to be talking about the electricity situation in Ontario, really from both a planning, a policy, as well as a political perspective. As many of you might be aware, the politics of energy and planning around energy and electricity pricing, reliability, and resiliency issues are all very intertwined in this province. And so one can't really look at where we're going on electricity and energy without thinking about the political environment and the policy environment. And we're going to be getting into that a little bit today. Obviously, it's a very interesting time. There's a lot of really exciting initiatives going on in Ontario, and in particular in Northern Ontario, from the Northwest and the Wataynikaneyap Power Project to the Soo and into Sudbury with the conversion of steelmaking in Sault Ste. Marie with Algoma Steel. Really interesting opportunities going on with the mining sector, new transmission being developed, a lot of new interest in hydroelectric development as well. It is a very exciting environment. It's a very fluid environment. There's a lot going on, and we're in many respects really just on the cusp of what we believe to be a transformation in the years to come. And so we're going to be talking a little bit this morning about how that's going to affect customers as well, and where there might be opportunities, but also perhaps where there might be some risks. So just a little bit on Sussex. I know there's a lot of familiar names and faces that have joined us today, but for those of you who don't know us, we're an advisory, market advisory, government relations and communications firm that very much specializes in a lot of issues around natural resources, industrial affairs, energy and the environment. Very much Ontario is our home. We have an office in both Toronto as well as Ottawa, and then we have folks in Quebec, British Columbia, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Alberta as well. We provide a range of services to a number of different organizations that really is about helping to communicate to various audiences, helping to manage risk, be it related to political policy or regulatory environments, and helping to work on what is often very large-scale commercial and industrial projects that have a lot of different facets to them that range from working with different host communities, Indigenous communities, all the way through to deep regulatory affairs. And as I say, I've done that on a number of different projects in Northern Ontario. The team of people that we have all have a great depth of experience in these areas, including people who have served in this Ford government, people who have served in the previous Liberal government, people who have served in government from a senior civil service standpoint, as well as system operators, regulators, environmental experts, and whatnot. So we have a great team of people that do work in these areas and have many decades worth of experience. So again, what we're going to be talking about today is a little bit of context around where we've been. Energy policy and industrial policy, as I say, are very intertwined, and to know where we stand today, one must look a little bit into the past to see where we've come from. We're going to talk about what's happening specifically in Northern Ontario, but also what effect the federal government is having on the energy and electricity landscape in Ontario, and then a little bit on the upcoming election, which isn't too far away now. So as I say, the energy and political environment in Ontario is very intertwined, and it has been probably for over 100 years. I'm in Toronto right now, and it's interesting. When you go into downtown Toronto, down University Avenue, there's a big monument to Sir Adam Beck. And then what's interesting is if you go kind of down University and then up towards Casa Loma, Sir Henry Pellet, there's a lot of history around electricity and politics in this province. And really what we've seen in more contemporary times is no different. I've indicated here some of the trends that we've seen over the last few decades, ranging from when I first got into the sector, which was a period of supply scarcity, changing fuel types, in particular at that period of time, a desire to get out of coal-fired generation, but also a recognition that we didn't have enough resources to meet our needs, combined with a massive amount of debt that had been incurred by the former Ontario Hydro, really caused the Harris and the Eves government at that time to look to restructuring the electricity system, both from a regulatory standpoint, from an institutional standpoint, and breaking up the former Ontario Hydro, but also to start establishing a market that would attract investment, with the recognition or the assumption at that point in time that it was better to introduce private sector investment into the marketplace to absorb risk rather than having the Treasury and the tax space take on all of that risk. Through the 1990s into the 2000s, we saw a lot of investment in the electricity space. Obviously, we had the blackout. We had a number of different spikes of policy intervention in the market related to market opening, and then subsequently a little bit of market closing. Really the push to get out of coal and introducing new gas into the system, followed by a lot of renewables, led to a huge divergence between the commodity price of electricity in Ontario and what we call the global adjustment, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, really ending the period of the 2010s in a state of global oversupply, too much electricity that we knew what to do with, not enough consumption, and burdened with a lot of high debt and a lot of high cost to consumers. Interestingly, just jump forward a few years into the 2020s, and now what we see is actually a period that is starting to look more and more like that late 1990s, early 2000s, where we have a massive amount of debt that is imbalanced within the system. We have concerns around supply scarcity evolving again, and I'll get into why that's the case. But we also have a lot of changes on the customer side as well, both in terms of new electrification, new demand for electricity, as well as changing habits of consumers. Particularly in Northern Ontario, we see this as well with regards to what I refer to as the spikiness of demand changes, where you have a situation where you have rather high intensive electricity uses in places where the transmission infrastructure hasn't necessarily been adapted to accommodate for those loads, or you have changes in the flow of electricity and how the power is going to work that is putting great new demands on both the supply side as well as the transmission side, and then obviously keeping pace with what industrial customers and what all customers, quite frankly, in the north are looking for. So really, if you go from the northwest all the way to the northeast down towards the French River, you can actually see various pockets of different needs that the system has, excuse me, ranging from a desire of remote communities to get off diesel generation and be supported by cleaner sources of power, to empowering mining opportunities that are often in more remote settings, to supporting the forestry sector, a lot of work that's now going on biomass generation and looking to the future of the biomass resources that we have in this province. And as I've mentioned, looking at steel as well and what the future will be of making steel, particularly in the Northeast. We're also very much looking at what is the range of water power assets that we have in the North and how can they be used not only to serve needs that exist in the North, but also how we can better optimize the electricity system that we have to take resources in the North, particularly electrons that are created in the North, and transport them into the South, where we have most of the electricity demand in this province. So because of this change, moving from a supply overabundance to a supply scarcity situation, and because of the change in demand patterns that we are seeing, we do feel like we're in the period of reform. What type of electricity resources do we need? What outcomes are we prioritizing? Be that around things like affordability, the clean nature of the electricity system that we have, resilience, which is a particular interest for industrial customers in Northern Ontario, again, where you have a lot of older both distribution and transmission infrastructure, and really looking out over the next, say, year to year and a half. We do believe that if you layer on the change in the political environment, particularly caused by an election, a lot of decisions that might happen over the next 12 to 18 months could have a huge impact on both the electricity system, but on the economy for the next 20 years. And again, I'll get into a bit more of that. So I thought it would be really interesting to think about where we've been, particularly if you recall in that period of 2016 and then really manifesting in the election of 2018. Electricity was a big issue for a lot of people in Ontario. Certainly there were issues around affordability. There were issues around local support for assets in their communities, particularly with regards to wind power generation in the South. But there was also a lot of concern about how we were managing the electricity system, and by we, really how government and its agencies were managing the electricity system. It's interesting to recall in the 2018 election, the Progressive Conservatives, initially led by Patrick Brown and then subsequently by Doug Ford, made electricity very, very priority issues, both in the campaign and then when they came into office in June of 2018. And really the focus was on removing costs and respecting taxpayers, respecting ratepayers, rebuilding local trust, giving municipalities and giving local communities and Indigenous communities a real more substantive say in the assets that would reside in their communities, and then correcting the perceived mismanagement of the electricity system. A lot of focus on both renewables as well as Hydro One specifically. But I would say as well, in that period of 2018 to early 2019, there was an overabundance of sentiment that the system was well served. It's a very expensive system. We don't really need to invest in things like conservation, energy efficiency. Quite frankly, we have too much electricity. We don't know what to do with it. And really what the focus needs to be on is reducing costs, finding affordability for customers. And then really, as we saw getting into the pandemic period, and then really manifesting in November of 2020 with the comprehensive electricity plan, how we could use the tax base to overly support electricity ratepayers in Ontario. So one little statistic I'll throw out, or little fact, is that the electricity system in Ontario today costs about $22 billion per year to manage. Historically, most of that, as a utility-based system, the intention is that that $22 billion will be recovered by electricity or from electricity ratepayers. But today, because of the cross-subsidization between the Treasury of Ontario or taxpayers to the ratepayers, about a third of all electricity costs are being paid by the Treasury of Ontario. That's amounting to about $7 billion a year worth of effectively debt that is being accumulated to help keep rates low for customers. And that's all customers, both Class A, Class B, as well as RPP customers. So, as we've seen over the last few years, we've gone not only from a period of overabundance to deficiency, and again, I'll get into that in a moment, but a big transition in terms of who's paying for what in the electricity system. So really, if we look to the earlier part of this government, you could define it very much by rationalism, prudency, not getting out over our skis and making decisions about investing in new technologies, really trying to suppress the energy file within government. In fact, what we saw in 2018 when the Conservatives came into office was moving the Ministry of Energy from being its own standalone ministry into a Ministry of Energy, Northern Development, and
Chris, sorry, you got fired up onto mute.
I don't know how that happened.
There we go. The magic of technology.
Yeah, so I don't know when that happened or how that happened, but yeah, to say really that again, that pivot from a situation where everything is good to what we've increasingly seen over the last year, to a situation that maybe it isn't so good anymore. So today in Ontario, we do have a pivot that's taking place over the last year. We do have needs in the system. There's a lot more consideration of what we call resource adequacy, or the ability to keep the lights on throughout the year, particularly in the hot summer months when everybody is firing up their air conditioners. Also, quite a bit of interest in terms of customer choice and optionality for all customers, both commercial, industrial, as well as residential customers, and an increasing interest in sustainability, the quality from an environmental standpoint of the electricity that we're producing and consuming. That doesn't mean that affordability is no longer important. It certainly is. But quite frankly, some of these other, and I would almost argue more fundamental issues around, do we have reliable power? Do we have enough energy to keep our lights on and our mills running and our operations going, is becoming a much more focused area of attention around planning and policy in this province. So where exactly do we stand today? We're about 8 weeks out from what we call the writ period, which is the campaign period. Thankfully, it's a rather short exercise, so it's not like in the United States where it seems to last forever. The election is on the 2nd of June, so it'll go by fairly quickly, about 5 weeks. But you look at some of the themes that exist right now around what's the future of policy, where are we going on things like gas-fired generation, where are we going on the quality of the system that we have, and promoting. And remember, we're getting into a deficiency of electricity in the province but yet we're talking quite often about enhanced electrification being a good thing, which I do think it is. Absolutely, it has a lot of value and attributes to it, but at the same time, it means creating more pressure on the electricity system, and can we keep up? There's also, of course, the question in terms of how are we paying for all of that electricity, and particularly for industrial customers. The government has expressed interest historically in things like industrial rate reform, things like the Northern Industrial Electricity Rebate Program, looking at Class B customers and how they're volumetrically exposed and how there could be some changes. And in fact, we do think that there will be some changes in those areas, and probably not so far into the distant future. So I just wanted to drill down for a moment in terms of, well, exactly what is that supply deficiency that we have in the system? And these are the latest ISO numbers that have been published. Now, I will say, for those that watch these matters carefully, and I know Ian Angus is on the call, and I'm sure other people here do, these are not the same numbers that the ISO has used over the last few years. In fact, for the last few years, the ISO kind of transitioned from a period of time where they said, well, there's really no significant need to speak of in the future, we'll be okay, to a period where they said, well, no, there are going to be some incremental needs, maybe a few hundred up to a few thousand megawatts, but we can use existing resources and we can look to optimize the system. But as more forecasts have been done, as electrification is really picking up, and is going back to the spikiness of electricity demand in Ontario, what the ISO is now forecasting is that we're going to need about 7,000 megawatts worth of both new and existing capacity, existing being generation assets that we have in the system that are either already off contract or will be coming off contract in the near term, to be recontracted. And within there's probably about 3,000 to 4,000 megawatts, maybe even more, that we need incrementally new capacity by 2026. Now, I want to be really clear. What do I mean by capacity? So capacity is the ability to deliver electricity to the grid at very, very defined times, particularly during the day and during the summer months. So think of it as on-demand electricity, or structured electricity at very, very specific times of the day and times of the year. So it's not just electricity from any resource. Not all resources can offer us firm capacity. And this is what we're talking about the deficiencies being, in terms of the ability to make sure that the power is there, particularly when we have the highest periods of demand, which tend to be during the hot summer months. There can be occasions where it's in the winter as well, but I think you see where I'm going with that. So we talk about 7,000 megawatts by 2026. The needs continue to go up into the next decade, up to about 12,000 megawatts. And you can see the two charts here in terms of that's being driven by certainly demand growth, resulting in the summer capacity deficiencies. There's another chart that I could show you about the assets that we have coming off contract and that will be decommissioned, in particular the Pickering nuclear generating station, which comprises a fairly significant part of our baseload supply in Ontario. But all of these things are cascading into a period of pretty significant need in this province. Every few months, when the ISO redoes some of it or recalculates some of its numbers, the trend line is only going in the direction of more need, more incremental need. So at the end of this month, the ISO will be coming out with a new annual acquisition report that will update some of these numbers, but we do believe it's causing them to really rethink what their activities will be in terms of, well, how do we ensure that we keep the lights on? Layered into that, I've mentioned a little bit already about, in the north, quite often what we see is beyond just the ability to create the electricity, it's also the ability to deliver the electricity to load, to where the customers are going to be consuming it, but also to do that in a resilient way, so that the power that you're getting has a high degree of quality to support business, to support new equipment, new technologies that are coming into the market. So if these are universal issues in Ontario, I would offer that they are particularly acute quite often in the north. So what about the cost? So we are, again, facing a supply deficiency. This is relatively novel. It will be for a number of businesses. We haven't really seen this since the mid 2000s. But there's a couple of other things that are happening. So because of the changing nature of the supply stack, the resources that we have in our system, over the next few years, we will be cycling more gas-fired generation than we have before. What that will cause is, because the way our electricity market works, that will mean that the hourly Ontario energy price, the wholesale commodity price, will be going up over the next few years. The global adjustment, which again, many of you are likely familiar with, will likely go down, particularly when Pickering comes out of the system. But again, because we're starting to invest and need to invest in a lot of new technologies, new things, new assets that are going on, everything from small modular reactors to hydroelectric facilities, that global adjustment number is going to start going up again. So we do our forecasts on a biannual basis, really when the ISO updated materials come out. And basically the net story here is that the cost of electricity in Ontario is going to be going up. Now, at the same time, there is this unprecedented amount of cross-subsidy. The number that you see in the chart on the lower side is drawn from the budget that the government released in 2001. And the dark blue is the amount of cost related to some forms of generation in the province that are now moved over to the tax base to pay for through the Treasury. It is around $3.1 billion annually. And as you can see from the chart, that remains fairly consistent over the next decade, a little bit less than that. But we are going to be continuing to spend billions of dollars per annum to help support the electricity system because of through or related to this form of generation, really up to the late 2030s. And this is on top of the Ontario Electricity Relief Program, as well as other subsidy programs that exist in the province. For example, the RRP, which some of you might be familiar with. So the underlying costs are going to go up. The amount of subsidy is going to continue, and we're moving into a supply scarcity situation. So some might call that a bit of a perfect storm, and we're kind of just at the beginning of it. So what are some of the policies and the priorities that are being talked about in terms of addressing these things? So there is a lot of work going on right now in terms of supply and demand, and I could probably spend the rest of our time just talking about that. Very specifically, there is quite a bit of interest in northern hydroelectric expansion. That would invariably be related or involve transmission resources as well. There's a lot of interest in terms of how we support new and emerging customers in the north. I know there's been some interest in SMR development and whatnot. But it's really, again, about how do we make sure that the lights stay on, but how do you do that in a cost-effective and in a smart way in terms of staging those resources and commissioning them and building them to keep pace to what the demand is. None of these things can be done quickly. So that's a big concern, kind of play back from when you're going to make or need the resources and how long does it take to build them, permit them and whatnot. And it does kind of feel for some, I think at least, that we're a little bit behind the 8 ball. At the same time, a lot of interest in customer choice. Class B dynamic pricing is a particularly interesting one right now. Class B customers, so these are customers that range from 50 kilowatt hours in their consumption up to anywhere, depending on the NACE code, from 500 kilowatts to a megawatt in size. These customers are completely volumetrically exposed to global adjustment in HOEP. There is some thinking about, are there some more dynamic pricing options that could be made available to those customers? For larger customers, what we call the Class A customers, could there be some optionality around the Industrial Conservation Initiative and perhaps an interruptible rate that some of you might be familiar with on the gas side? That's something that I think has been discussed. A lot of interest in continued electrification, climate change, a lot of interest in things like social licenses I was referring to before, as well as regulatory modernization, largely to keep pace with new technology and process adoption. And what's really interesting about this market, I will say that It is something that the current government has expressed an interest in looking at and evolving. And in fact, there was a consultation on this held earlier last year, but we don't have an integrated resource plan or a long-term energy plan in Ontario today. We are one of the very few, if not the only jurisdiction in North America that doesn't really have one. Because some of the trends that we're seeing are not Ontario specific, of course, the trend towards reducing carbon emissions, enhanced electrification, greater customer choice, introducing new technologies like the electrification of transport and electric vehicles is being felt universally. Most other places have plans that accommodate for that, and Ontario doesn't really have a cohesive energy plan at the moment. This government has talked about doing that, and it's something that, of course, we're very eager to see come about. So I'm going to take a moment just to talk about the federal government. And I will say that conventional, I've been doing this work for over 20 years, and we don't really often need to think about the federal government in the context of Ontario electricity policy because our constitution says it's none of their business. But what we have seen over the last few years is this coming together of both energy policy, electricity policy, and environmental policy that is bringing the federal government into the equation from both a carrots and a sticks perspective. And so maybe just on first on the sticks, what we're seeing today is a movement towards things like carbon pricing on emissions, moving to $170 a metric ton by 2030. We know that the government has talked about coming out with the federal government a plan to achieve net zero in our electricity system by 2035. I was actually on the phone this morning with some government officials in New Brunswick. All the provinces are waiting to see, quite frankly, what that federal government plan coming out from Environment and Climate Change Canada will look like, because that will have a big determining factor on how we model both the options from a technical standpoint as well as what the cost will be in our electricity system, particularly at the end of the decade and going into the 2030s. And we do see these things as sticks. They're tools that the federal government is using intentionally to try and affect the shape and the characteristics of a market in a way that wouldn't otherwise be created. But they're also looking at a series of carrots, and that's largely in the form of a huge amount of subsidy through grants, equity, loans that are provided now to various assets in the system, largely related to clean fuels, clean electricity, and reducing carbon emissions. And to give you a sense of how that's actually showing up in the Ontario electricity system, I thought it would actually be helpful to point out a few examples of projects that we have in Ontario today that have really benefited and likely would not have happened without those kinds of support tools from the federal government. A great one in Northern Ontario is Wataynikaneyap Power. So this is a project that is owned by 24 First Nations in the Northwest, along with Fortis, that is under construction right now to connect 17 communities in Northwest Ontario. And we're really excited to, I think the first communities, there could be a flipping of the switch, hopefully this year. So really excited about that. A more recent one is the Oneida Battery Park that's being developed by Enerstore along with the Six Nations of the Grand River in Jarvis, Ontario. That's a 250 megawatt battery storage solution. It will be the largest battery storage solution in Canada and actually one of the largest ones in North America. They've received $170 million from the Canada Infrastructure Bank and another $50 million from the SREPS program. So it is something that I suspect is going to be moved on fairly soon. There's the Lake Erie Connector project, which is being proposed by another Fortis company, ITC, which will interconnect Ontario to the largest electrical market in the world, what we call PJM interconnection. It comprises 13 states in the United States. They secured $655 million from the Canada Infrastructure Bank back in April. And we know that there's probably going to be more in terms of SMR development, micromodular reactors. We know that there's a lot of interest in pump storage and hydrogen. There is a proposed pump storage project up in Schreiber. So then the big question is, of course, what's next? There are billions and billions of dollars available. And the way that money is really manifesting in the marketplace is to help support and augment monies that are coming and would otherwise come from the ratepayers of Ontario. So it's another form of revenue, or it's another form of support mechanism that is helping to induce investment in certain assets in this province that are helping to reshape the supply demand sort of landscape that we have in the Ontario electricity system. So maybe just to conclude, and then I think we're going to get into a bit of a question and answer period. We do have an election coming up. These folks don't seem to be all that thrilled about it right now, but they are out there raising money. They're making appearances, and they're obviously working on their platforms. What's really interesting about energy and the political environment in Ontario, it's always an election issue. It's not a question of whether it will be an election issue. It's more of a question of how it's going to show up. And so, you know, there will be points that the various political parties will use around electricity and environmental issues. But I would say that this is one of the very few times that I think we can say that all the political parties, the main ones, seem to be swimming in the same direction. They're all talking about reducing carbon emissions in the electricity space. They're all talking about the need for incremental investments. They're all talking about supporting customers and choice around things like electric vehicles. They're all supporting the notion of doing more both at the transmission and the distribution level. There might be a little bit of difference here and there on things like nuclear, but by and large, they're all kind of swimming in the same direction. Oh, excuse me. So again, you know, we are really focused now on what's going to happen as we lead up to the 2nd of June. All the political parties are pretty much transitioning into election mode. I know we're expecting a few more things to happen on energy before May comes around, but boy, oh boy, the months are now ticking by pretty quickly. And, you know, we will be getting into that election space pretty soon. What we often advise clients around this time is that, you know, this is going to be a critical year, we think, notwithstanding the politics around the choices that we're making and how we're supporting the needs that we're going to have in various communities across this province. It's a big problem-solving exercise. So solutions brokering, you know, how we solve some of these problems and really working together. From customers to the utilities, both at the distribution level, the transmission level, generators, as well as government and their agencies, everybody working together to address these shared problems is going to be very important, because we do need to get to detail both on a policy, a planning, and a roadmap basis. But we're certainly looking forward to doing that over the months to come. So that's a fairly quick review, and maybe Rory, I'll turn it back to you.
That's fantastic. And Chris, maybe you can leave the slides up just in case we need to refer back to them. Sure. If any questions pop up on that. And I'll just encourage people, if you do wish to ask anything of Chris, you can either put it in the chat function, or we're fairly tight group here. I will not be able to see everybody. But certainly feel free to unmute and then just introduce yourself and whom you represent, and ask Chris that question. Maybe we can stay sort of on the politics of things right now as we are heading into that election. There was a great session held by Sussex Strategy yesterday on, you know, how the election is starting to shape up and what will be some of the key issues. And what was identified, and I think it will resonate here as well with people in Northern Ontario, is affordability, right? This is the number one issue, whether it's housing, cost of living, you know, and energy is part of that. And then Chris, you speak to, you know, one, we need investment, which means somebody's got to pay for it. Two, we're looking at increased, you know, costs. And how is that going to start to play in how the parties, even though on the same page, how do you think that that's going to play out in the upcoming election?
So, you know, I think, Rory, in many respects, you know, this will not be an election. We're not expecting it's going to be an election where you see huge differences fundamentally between the three parties everybody supports childcare. Everybody supports, revitalizing the economy, excuse me, stimulating the economy post-pandemic. There will be little nuggets, obviously, differentiators between the three. But I think what this election is largely going to come down to is a question of trust and competence. Who do you trust to guide us through this recovery exercise? Who do you think is most capable or competent to do that? And I think when it comes to affordability issues, you're absolutely right. I will say that the needle on affordability, and that being a leading issue for Ontarians, hasn't changed since the federal election last fall. In many respects, it was very evident in 2018 as well. One of the things that we saw in 2018 is that there was about 22, I think it was, percent of the population that felt economically distraught, not just vulnerable, but really in a point of despair, where you really do start thinking about core issues around food security of food and food affordability and housing affordability. And I don't think the situation has gotten much better. In fact, I think it's gotten horribly worse. Fiscal prudence is something that typically we talk about in election periods and balancing budgets and the pathway to balance budgets. And, you might recall from other elections that there's this traditional thing that political parties will do to go to, luminaries in financial accountability or whatnot to vet, whether their platform is fully costed or balanced or whatnot. I don't know if anybody cares about fiscal prudence anymore. And so I think it's really interesting when you're in a frame where affordability is by far, the biggest issue that people are thinking about, and is now really the time to talk about fiscal restraint when it comes to things like balancing budgets and balancing books. So I don't think that that's going to be a big facet in the election. I think it's about spending money to help support people. The pandemic is still a real thing for a lot of people. And quite frankly, a few weeks ago, we thought that it was going to be the protests, in Windsor and Ottawa that was leading to a feeling of instability for a lot of people. With everything now going on in Ukraine, excuse me, boy, it feels like those protests were a long time ago.
Indeed.
And so I really do think that affordability is going to manifest. I don't think we're going to talk much about fiscal prudency is a good way of putting it. And I think that really it's going to be a question of like, who do you believe in? Who do you trust?
Interesting. And, just maybe in a general conversation then around, world events today and the push to electrification. Do you think that, weaning off the oil and gas, I mean, we haven't bought oil from Russia from a couple of years, but obviously we do buy it from other jurisdictions. And how do you think that might influence the investments in infrastructure and electrification?
So it's already having an effect, Roy. I can tell you today, even I've noticed between Q4 of last year and this quarter, foreign exchange risk, interest rates rising, inflationary pressures, scarcity of supply of material and equipment is having a direct impact on everything from cabling, steel, resources, lithium ion carbonate, for example. There's a lot of interest in batteries, the chemical batteries in our market. Lithium ion carbonate prices have gone up by something like 400% in the last quarter. Global supply chains have been disrupted. There's a lot of volatility in global markets. So the price, so if you look at how much it's costing for the bricks and mortar that go into the assets that we need to build, and again, remember, we're shifting into a scarcity situation, so we need to buy more steel, we need to buy more equipment, we need to invest more things. Those prices, are only going up, and the global supply chain for those material is getting tighter. So we're globally competing now for a lot of resources that we need for some of those core assets. And I haven't even mentioned the skills deficiency that we have, particularly in the north. So all of these things and the labor deficiency. So it's it's this compounding perfect storm that like I tend to by default be an overly optimistic person, glass half full, and you have to be, but there's some turbulent times ahead of us.
No, indeed. And I think we're all experiencing that. It'll be interesting to see how things develop over the near term.
Yeah, and Rory, the one thing that I will say is that, going back to my point about fiscal prudency and be it a federal or a provincial government, and when does, a finance minister say, well, we can't keep on just spending money and incurring debt, because that's what you speak to. How will governments accommodate this? We need to do all the things that we need to do. We'll just, quite frankly, incur more debt to do it. But when does somebody say stop? And when do you see that pendulum turn? It will at some point. But is that in the near term? Is it in the longer term? Is it years from now? That is unclear.
Yeah, and then you've got, I think, some underlying impacts too of monetary policy, right? I mean, we've just seen a lot of money printed to get us through the challenges of pandemic, and that's had its impacts on inflation. But I see Dave McCaddy's got a question. Dave, I see it in the chat box, but why don't you just come off mute and ask Chris directly, and just maybe introduce yourself and whom you represent.
Sure. Dave McCaddy with Tenaris. We're a steel pipe manufacturer, a global company, but investing in our Canadian manufacturing and expect to continue to do so. However, we do have some uncertainties, and the oil and gas industry is our primary customer today and will continue to be that way for the foreseeable future. The Canadian oil and gas industry is investing in reducing its emissions, is investing in carbon capture and storage.
Yes.
Hydrogen hubs are being developed
Yes.
in Edmonton, and they can be developed across the country. But our concern is and you painted the picture extremely well. The issue is about vision and execution to convince Canadians, and in this case, the people of Ontario, to understand that their government needs to invest in these sources of energy for us. Energy, electricity, hydrogen, that probably first is blue hydrogen, then green. And we need to have confidence that this is going to be not, one election cycle, we go in one direction, another cycle, we go in another direction, but this is sustained, because if we're going to continue to invest in creating jobs or sustaining jobs, maintaining jobs, energy costs and availability are very important to us. If we're going to be investing in eliminating reheat furnaces or converting those from natural gas to hydrogen, those are requiring 3 times the quantity of hydrogen to natural gas, which is going to make it, if the price was more or less the same, 3 times more costly. I don't get the sense that governments understand how really expensive this is for industry, and how we are not going to be able to invest in this without government partners, both helping us make those capital investments, but also providing the certainty of the supply of energy at an affordable price. And I'm wondering how we can communicate this better as a group, because it's a real challenge. And as you said just recently, this is a globally competitive world. And if we don't act as Canadians, others will, and we will be left on the sidelines.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, David, and completely agree. And to your point about CCUS and hydrogen hubs, so the Ontario government has they have gone to market. There is a posting out there right now where they're soliciting comment on CCUS development opportunities in Ontario, and of course they've consulted both through the Environment Ministry and the Energy Ministry on hydrogen. We're actually expecting. There's a lot of interest, quite frankly, in hydrogen hubs. We're expecting some evolution and movement on that, particularly with OPG in the near term. So we are eager to see some of those things come as well. I do think that there are some issues, though, when it comes to, you mentioned, is there a good understanding of what the future looks like from a cost perspective? And how is that helping to inform the choices that you're making? From what I've seen, I don't think that there is. And I think that, in many things, even particularly like hydrogen and CCUS, they're two great examples where I still think that we're at the stage in figuring out what the technical capabilities are. And what, if I just think about hydrogen, what are the upstream, midstream, and downstream? Like, what does that look like? And what do we want to prioritize and where, and how do we bring that all together? I think we're going to get there. Is it fast enough for what the market needs? Is it fast enough to help stimulate activity? That remains to be seen, but it's only going to get more complicated. And, I think it's really going to put a lot of stress, quite frankly, on regulators, on governments, on their agencies to be thoughtful and deliberative on the actions that they're taking and move quickly. And it's not something that government is always great at. So, to your point, David, around, what do we do? This is why I made the point around detailed, policy and roadmaps. I think the best, or one thing to consider, is do as much of that preparatory work for them to basically create the stepped approach of what the market needs to accommodate the kind of change, or accommodate for the changes that we'll see in the future. I know it might sound a little bit glib in terms of don't do the work for them, or don't leave things to chance. But quite frankly, these trends are coming so quickly that we really do think that you need to take almost like a steps memo approach to, okay, well, how do we game this out, and how are we going to properly manage all of this and not leave anything to chance?
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, for that. And maybe I can just comment a little bit on that as well about, the evolution of how fast things are moving. We know, that battery manufacturing from critical minerals is sorry, and I just wanted to say, to build on that, this notion of being not necessarily first to market, but at least speed to market, and that connection between providing that energy infrastructure to Northern Ontario that is adopting a critical minerals strategy is a key component of battery and battery storage, and not just pulling the minerals out, but actually adding value to those minerals to create the batteries themselves is a great opportunity, I think, for Northern Ontario. But we know that market will hit a certain point of consolidation. And, how do you get that infrastructure, to David's point, into market as quick as possible to gain that kind of first mover advantage?
Mm-hmm.
It's, and how do we drive, as you say, it's not particularly going to be an election issue. It always seems that business and economics tends not to be an election issue these days. And that economic roadmap, I think, like you say, is critical to Northern Ontario and the development of Northern Ontario. And,
I will say this, it's not directed to any political party or the incumbent government at all, but I think that there's value across the political spectrum and across the different layers of government. We need less platitudes and more plans that are defined and executable, because we have an environment now that tends to veer towards platitudes, and we don't need any more of that.
Absolutely. Tom, if you could introduce yourself and who you represent.
Great, thanks, Rory. Hi, Chris. I'm Tom Varum with the City of Sault Ste. Marie. My question for you: have there been any studies that estimate how much of the forecasted gap can be filled by new hydro development projects, and maybe realistically other renewable sources? How much of that gap could be filled?
Yeah, so there have historically been studies done, and in fact, I know Paul Norris. I got a note from him earlier. I thought he was going to try and join us, but I don't know if he's on this call. But he's with the Ontario Water Power Association. They've recently been asked, along with OPG, to work on a hydroelectric potential study, particularly for new and expanded hydroelectric resources in the north, that are to not only address the gaps that are existing from a northern standpoint, but really from a whole bulk system standpoint in the southern, well, in the province as a whole. So yes, we do have an understanding of what the potential is. We know that there's a study underway now to look at the future potential of hydroelectric development. And, you know, I made the point that almost invariably, because of the Great Lakes, we have to look at that in terms of transmission as well. So what is the potential to utilize resources that we have that are largely in the north to help support electricity demand that is largely in the south, while supporting our regional economies as well and the transmission infrastructure to do that. So yes, historical studies absolutely are there. And the good news is that they're in the process of being updated as we speak.
Okay, thank you.
Chris, when we talk about these projects, what are you seeing trending out in terms of, you know, private-public partnerships, but also public-private Indigenous partnerships?
Yeah.
And the latter being, you know, potentially one of the most important elements in developing Northern Ontario.
You know, it's the pride of my career, Rory, that I've had the opportunity for the last decade to work on a project in Northwestern Ontario called Wataynikaneyap Power. And, you know, that was such a groundbreaking project in many ways. It wasn't the first Indigenous-led infrastructure project, particularly in infrastructure. Five Nations happened back in the 90s, 2000s. But certainly, you know, the ability to reinforce electricity security and supply to really change the future outlook of prosperity in the Northwest is really quite remarkable. And that, I'm convinced, could only have been done with First Nations leadership and a move towards over time 100% ownership. And I think it does in many ways serve as a beacon in terms of what the art of the possible is. We see other transmission projects that have a good amount of Indigenous participation, both the East-West tie that I think is going to be done this year, and then a new project called the Waasigan line that is in the Northwest and the west of Thunder Bay area. From a generation standpoint, we've seen and have had the privilege to work on a lot of Indigenous partnered and Indigenous-led projects. I think it's an area, Rory, that it goes to the social license aspect, but it's also about harnessing the skill set, the experience, and you know, what Indigenous businesses and communities can bring to the table. We see it as almost it's a must do. It's and really to witness how, you know, themes like accommodation to partnership have really kind of transformed over the last 20 years has been remarkable to see. So we're going to see more of that. And I think that in terms of the types of projects that we're going to see, I would say, you know, there's great opportunity for hydroelectric development. We know that there's a lot of natural gas expansion opportunities that some Indigenous in the Northwest, and I know that there's other communities like Schreiber and Wawa and others that are looking at gas expansion to help serve their local communities. Storage is a huge area. We think we're going to see a lot of storage. And quite frankly, the magnitude of the activities that are going to be needed are robust. Because right now, I think there's a lot of focus, particularly in Sault Ste. Marie and Algoma Steel. I know Brenda's on the call. There might be others from Algoma. What an incredible project. It's going to be a heavy lift, to be quite honest, from an electricity standpoint. You know, with some of these changes, you need a lot of power. But the same can be said about transformative opportunities in Sudbury, in Timmins, near Timmins, and in other places. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done.
Interesting. And you know, just to touch base on the natural gas, I mean, what's your view in terms of some of the pressures that are being applied to the use of natural gas, decarbonization,
Yeah.
and whether grandfathered or future cogeneration projects?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, cogeneration, you know, cogeneration is something that is still exceptionally important. And, you know, you know, I was about to say, Rory, it's a little bit of in the eye of the beholder. I'll give you an example. One of our clients is Enwave, which is a district energy heating company that is now in a number of different places across North America, but started as the Toronto heating and cooling district energy system. I forget exactly the name, but so we have 80 buildings in downtown Toronto that are all supplied by Enwave through deep lake water cooling and communal heating. Well, the heating comes from gas plants. They have 4 gas plants in downtown Toronto, and yet district energy is and it is seen as a great environmental initiative. Cogeneration itself, harnessing, wasted heat, or, creating thermal energy through the process of creating electricity is great. We're seeing, a variation on the theme, fuel blending, renewable natural gas, hydrogen and natural gas. So, I think that there's no cliffs here. It's not, I don't think, outside of coal and kind of getting off coal by fixed dates, from a power generation standpoint, I think that gas is more under the guise of energy transition and looking at how we utilize gas in a sensible way to help meet environmental goals. And there's an absolute great way of doing it. We're going to be doing, I know that Sault Ste. Marie will be doing it. You have great thermal resources in Lake Superior, the former Lake Superior Power and whatnot. And so you can really use those resources to benefit. It's just doing those strategically.
Certainly, if you're talking about thermal generation from Lake Superior, it's getting energy transferred from the very cold to just cold.
Yeah,
because it always seems to be cold.
Fair enough.
Yeah, but no, and maybe just to turn an eye to the far north, and what potentially would be the role of SMR, small modular reactors, in changing the economy of the far north, but also changing the social aspects of ensuring quality power to many of the communities up there, as well as the projects.
Both small modular reactor development as well as micro modular reactor development. So when you get into the 5 megawatt and under sort of category of nuclear technologies that are out there, both Gen 3 and Gen 4, it's really exciting what's going on. I know that there's a new technology that's being deployed through Global First Power at Chalk River. I don't quote me on this, but I know that levelized cost of energy, they look at the outlook and it's very comparable to gas. And really what it gets you is a high degree of energy reliability, and particularly with some of the newer technologies, a high degree of flexibility. So depending on the configuration of the technologies and whatnot, you can stack, you can cycle, you can do them in serial, you can have some degree of load following and whatnot. But a lot of these technologies are quite proven in the sense that they're really just scaled down versions of light water and pressurized water reactors that have existed for many, many years. And we shouldn't forget that there's nuclear reactors in submarines and aircraft carriers. So there's small micro reactors that there's a lot of global familiarity with. There is a fuel supply issue. And in fact, the conflict in Ukraine is exposing some of that, because Russia is a big supplier of a lot of that fuel. So, one of the things, and it's actually nuclear is one of those areas that it's a very direct impact in terms of the cost and the availability of supply that we have to be mindful of. But having said that, I think that there is a lot of optimism of what nuclear can provide, fundamentally too, on a very small footprint. And that's the other thing to note is that, typically when we're speaking about the far north, we're either dealing with like infrastructure that requires a very large footprint, say, for example, hydroelectric development and whatnot, or where you need long linear assets like transmission. The promise, I guess, is that, you're developing with a far smaller footprint that can have a far lesser of an impact on ecosystems. So still a lot of in the pre-commercial or early stage commercial. I think, quite frankly, we would see that it's far more likely that you see some of that technology develop in the oil sands probably before it gets to Northern Ontario. But I think that eventually there is an opportunity.
How does the capital investment in comparison to, like you say, linear assets, how does that look?
Right. So I mean, you have to really think about whether or not you want to be serial number one. You know, I think like a lot of technologies, it's maybe you want to be serial number two. The cost might be a little bit better. But yeah, I think that you know, it's one of those things that over time, I think we'll get a better sense of what the cost will be. Quite frankly, we don't have very good cost forecasts on a lot of these technologies right now. For example, the SMR down selection that OPG recently made with GE Hitachi, it's great technology. They're not yet exactly at the stage of kind of knowing what their cost envelope will be. A bit more work needs to be done on that front, but you know, and that can be said for some other technologies in the nuclear space as well. But you know, often what I believe is in the ballpark of what you would expect to see on gas. But of course, if you're developing off grid in a remote setting, the cost of conventional supply, you know, is often quite high.
Yeah, and how do you think that is impacting then opportunity? You know, we see still a lot of interest in mining in Northern
Yep.
Ontario. And how is that scarcity, if you like, and lack of infrastructure being assessed by those looking at investments?
You know what my experience has been, and I had the privilege until they left the market, but I worked with Cliffs, and you might recall Cliffs
Yep.
was quite involved in the Ring of Fire development, and I can tell you from that experience that there was actually a lot of stability that was formed in terms of what the price of electricity would be, and I think that there was an increasing assurity, like you could see how the energy was going to be developed to serve that particular load and to support that. So and the only thing that's really changed over time is that now you probably have more options than you did before. So there's more on the menu, you can choose more, you can assess more. I don't know if that's the greatest issue. You know, I think what's always been a real challenge is how do you get the commodity to market? And you know, now this is a very personal view for what it's worth. Others might disagree, but I think that if that question can be figured out, how do you get the commodity to market? The ability to power the resource will be figured out.
Interesting, interesting. And then, you know, maybe we can just talk a little bit, Chris, in comparing Southern Ontario to Northern Ontario. I mean, you know, especially when we talk about EVs, right? Electrical vehicles and the electrification of transportation. You know, it's a very different world in Southern Ontario where you've got, you know, density and intensity of market versus the geography that we've got in Northern Ontario. And how do you balance the demands of, you know, and even from a policy and a political perspective from a consumer perspective, really, in Southern Ontario versus the commercial and industrial needs, and to a lesser extent, maybe the consumer needs in Northern Ontario?
Yeah, the other thing about the north, depending on where you are in the north, it can get really, really quite cold. You know, chemical batteries, there's been some issues in the past about when long, and it's like, it's kind of like, you know, just going back to your question about nuclear, particularly CANDUs, they don't like it when it's hot and humid for a long period of time. You can kind of get away with it for maybe a day or two, but if you have a few days where it's really hot and humid, they don't really like that very much. Batteries are the same thing in the north. They don't like it when it's like really cold for a long persistent period of time. And
we always say, try driving from Sault Ste. Marie to Sudbury when it's -40.
right. So like, I think you have to think about that, right? And I know that there's some thinking around even the transition, because a lot of OEMs are talking about full conversions are no longer manufacturing combustion engines by a certain date. How do you support and how do you stage that transition in places like the north? You know, where you need to be maybe a bit more acutely aware of the transition needs than you would be in Toronto. So yeah, I do think that there's I guess all of that to say, Rory, I think there's a very physical policy aspect to that is very real and has been discussed. I think that when it comes to, you know, the cost elements and supporting, you know, the way often, at least from electricity standpoint, people have looked at it is to try to find balanced and try to find parity in terms of what the exposure to cost would be between customers in the north and customers in the south. So if you look at things like distribution rate protection or the triple RP, or there are other mechanisms that attempt to try and levelize costs. The Northern Industrial Electricity Rebate was designed by the same way. You know, companies that operate in Southern Ontario complain that they don't have access to that mechanism that exists in the north. Yeah, but it's a lot more expensive to do business in the north than it is in the south. These were done for parity reasons, to try and bring things into some semblance of balance. You're never going to get it perfectly right, but that was the policy rationale quite often of why you do those things. And I think that as we see more costs and changes of technology and whatnot, we're going to have to think, and governments will have to think about, how do you make sure that that underlying principle of parity, and maybe even giving economic advantage to draw people to a particular place, is thought through and designed and then executed upon. I will note that in other places, certainly I'm familiar with Canada and the United States, but there are other markets where they have preferential pricing, like in Newfoundland, for example, to attract people to more places where you want more economic activity and more investment. So I think that's also something, like tying economic development to smart electricity rate policies and making sure that you have the infrastructure to support communities. A lot of work needs to be done on it. We need a plan.
Yeah. Yeah, that certainly seems to be resonating, that a plan is needed. Any questions from our attendees? Please feel free to unmute and ask Chris. We still have a little bit of time left here. It's a great opportunity to take advantage of a master in his class. What maybe we'll just talk about a little bit here then in terms of how are we seeing markets play out, and I guess starting to attract, or how are we seeing the attraction of investment, whether it's national or international, and how that starts to marry up with a number of issues around climate change and the focus on climate change and the need to decarbonize. Are we seeing investment move away from that, or are we seeing it be more attracted to that as it becomes more grassroots?
So I'll maybe on the latter point, in terms of how ESG, let's say ESG requirements are kind of coming into asset choice. From a power system planning standpoint, it isn't really right now. The way our power system is defined and the way procurement is defined is quite frankly lowest cost kilowatt hour, or lowest cost capacity. It's low cost is the underlying, and the ability of the technology to do what you want it to do in terms of reliability or resiliency or whatever it might be. One of the things that the ISO is looking at now, though, is planning around decarbonization, and we would expect that over time that gets accounted for in terms of, how do you build that into procurements so that you're valuing that in some way, and that you're creating evaluative criteria that gives weighting to things like carbon intensity. Carbon intensity, we think, is going to be a big theme. Again, no cliffs, but looking at carbon intensity, if you can make a gas-fired generator more, or I should say less carbon intensive, that's a good thing. So we do see that that's going to increasingly be an element of how the market is choosing between different investments, different kinds of assets. Beyond that, in terms of how is the system right now inducing investment into the assets that we're going to need, it is what we call a monopsony. We have one buyer of electricity fundamentally in Ontario from a supply standpoint, and that's the Independent Electricity System Operator. And they have 4 tools that they're using right now to induce investment in assets. One is a capacity auction that they're running on an annualized basis. It's every December. And they're offering seasonal commitments for capacity. We do see some off-contract generation clear and get secured through that, but a lot of it is demand response that we're seeing through the capacity auction. They are also looking at, they're actually starting to run a midterm RFP right now, midterm commitment. It's to recontract existing assets that we have in the system for a 5-year duration. And these are largely gas assets that are either already off contract or will be coming off contract. You have some others in the north. Nipigon is a good example, for instance. So that is another conduit by which they're looking to secure resources. The big one that a lot of people are focused on right now is a long-term commitment RFP. They've talked about 7 to 10 years. I suspect it'll be longer than that. And they've talked about procuring around 1,000 megawatts. I suspect it's going to be more than that. That will be needed to help serve our needs in the mid part of this decade onward over term. And that's quite interesting. There's a lot of thinking about what kind of resources those will be. We suspect it's largely going to be energy storage, but quite frankly, it could be a number of different things. It'll be interesting to see how they deal with gas plants and the potential to not necessarily build brand new gas plants, but incrementally expand gas plants that we already have. Again, watch for that theme of carbon intensity and see how that kind of evolves. And then the fourth one is bilateral engagements. And in fact, bilateral engagements is actually what we're seeing the most in terms of inducing investment in assets. And that's, I go to the Oneida Energy Storage Project, or right now they're bilaterally recontracting a big facility in Windsor, one in Lennox, which is near Kingston. They're undergoing bilateral contract negotiations with a few biomass generators. CalStock is one that is just at the tail end of their recontracting exercise. There's Chapleau up in Hearst.
Actually, I wanted to ask you about, the role of Northern Ontario in the generation of energy through biomass.
Yep. Yeah. So like these, the ISO is going out and procuring a lot of things right now, but I will say they need to procure it more. They probably need to do it faster. And so we'll wait and see what that looks like. Biomass, is very important. I will say that not all biomass is created equal, in the sense that facilities are doing different things. They're integrated operations in different ways. Some are standalone power producers, others are integrated within existing forestry operations. All of them are serving a broader economy. There are companies from Liqueur and Columbia and Ecom and whatnot that are all in that supply chain, and lots of others. So it is an ecosystem, I think, in the north that I will say that up until fairly recently, I don't think was very well understood by folks in Toronto. I do think that is getting better. And I think that the needs, particularly in the West, are becoming quite significant. For those of you who are operating, you see what the HOEP prices are looking like, and I don't know if there's any generators on this call, but anyway, the needs are becoming more evident. And so, I think that there is an appreciation that these biomass resources are valuable, not only for the electrons that they create, but for the economies that they're supporting. And we see those assets. In fact, we see, quite frankly, all of them continuing to provide value and operate for a very long period of time. The one question I think that will persist for a while is, are there alternative uses for the biomass? And that could create opportunities, quite frankly, in the north. But my sense, and Ian and other people might have other people on this call would probably have a deeper, better perspective than I do. But I think that there are opportunities there. I don't know how far away they are. My sense is that they're a little bit of time away, but I think that there could be opportunities.
Interesting. I'll just go to the floor one last time to ask if there's any questions. And if not, then, Chris, is there a final thought you would love to leave us with?
Yeah, Rory, it's really been a pleasure to spend some time. And as I say, I wish we could have done it in person. I have an immense amount of respect for people doing business up in Northern Ontario and the complexities, but also the opportunities that that creates. And, you know, I think that, you know, because of some of these dynamics that we're facing is really causing us to kind of reflect upon, you know, the type of electricity system that we need to have in this province over time, how it needs to support customers, but exactly what all of that means. And we keep on coming back to, we need details. We need to work together to figure out the specifics and the particularities of what needs to be done, when, how quickly, at what cost. And this is only going to be done through a collective effort. So really, it's been a pleasure to spend some time with you, and certainly happy to follow up if there's any questions afterwards. But really, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Chris, thank you very much. We know your time is in high demand, and we really appreciate you spending this time with us, and the time and energy you put into the Energy Committee at the Ontario Chamber of Commerce as well. So that's greatly appreciated. So thanks very much, everybody, for coming today. Just a quick reminder that we do have coming up on March 8th, the difference makers, our women in business, and all are welcome. And I mean, all are welcome. And there should be a great event there of some local difference makers. And we have a keynote from senior executive of OLG presenting as well. Also, keep your eye out for notifications of our series Resource Champions. We're rescheduled, finalizing our rescheduling of the session on creating Indigenous prosperity. So please continue to stay in touch through our website. And if you do have any questions, please feel free to reach out to myself, and I can certainly connect you with Chris if it's not answered in the deck. And I guess with the recording, you'll have a copy of the deck as well in that recording. So that would be a good reference point for you as well. So I thank you all for joining us. It's very much appreciated. And once again, Chris, thank you to joining us. And thanks to my team of Maggie and Don for supporting this program today. So thanks very much, everybody. Enjoy the rest of the day and have a great weekend.